Imagine standing in a chapel that was never meant for joy, a place where silence clings heavier than prayer, and where vows are whispered not out of love, but out of blood. In that suffocating stillness, a young woman dressed in white says, "I do." But across from her, it isn't a stranger nor a suitor chosen by fate. It's her brother. Flesh of the same flesh, bone of the same bone. The echo of her words doesn't just seal a marriage, it seals a lineage into something unnatural, a cycle of inheritance that is less about land or wealth and more about deformity, madness, and despair. For generations, whispers had been buried, neighbors looked the other way, and the family itself convinced one another that this was not sin, but duty. What began as a union justified by desperation would end as one of the darkest stories ever to be carved into the hidden history of America. We are not speaking of royalty in far-off lands where cousin marriages kept crowns upon heads. No, this was something more secretive, more haunting, and more ordinary. It happened here in the American heartland, far away from castles and titles. In forgotten valleys and isolated farmhouses, families built their own kingdoms of blood, cut off from the world until the world no longer recognized them. This is where our story begins, not in triumph, but in silence, because silence is the soil in which secrets grow deepest. And when a brother and sister stood at that altar, their vows didn't only bind them to each other. They chained an entire bloodline to a destiny no one could escape. Some say they loved each other, others say they had no choice. The truth is far darker, hidden in the records of birth and death, in photographs no one dares to frame, and in stories whispered by old neighbors who swear they remember. When you look closely, the union was not just between two people, it was between generations. Tito does. Lapsing into themselves like a house with no foundation. The result? Children who carried not just the names of their parents, but the twisted remnants of their parents' choices written across their bodies, their faces, their very voices. This was not a single mistake. It was an inheritance of ruin. And the haunting truth is that for this family, the line between love and horror disappeared the moment she said those two words, "I do." The further you dig into this family's story, the harder it becomes to understand where choice ended and inevitability began. They lived in a corner of America that was already forgotten, a rural patch of land where dirt roads carved isolation into the earth and where neighbors were more like distant rumors than familiar faces. In that kind of world, family was not just the first bond, it was often the only bond. When blood is the only company you have, blood becomes both prison and sanctuary, and from that twisted soil, the unthinkable can start to feel natural. The brother and sister who stood at that altar were not the beginning. They were the outcome of years of whispered arrangements, of cousins marrying cousins, of families collapsing inward until the family tree no longer branched outward at all. Theirs was not a tree, but a loop. An unbroken circle where the same names reappeared generation after generation. Fathers became grandfathers, cousins became spouses, and the faces in old photographs seemed to blur together as though the bloodline itself refused to let go of its own reflection. But in this particular story, one detail stands out. The brother was older, hardened by the weight of a failing farm and a family name already shamed by rumors. The sister, younger, quieter, raised in the shadow of expectations she never agreed to but could not resist. Neighbors said she had a softness in her face, a trace of beauty that could have carried her away had she been given the chance. But she wasn't. Her world was fenced off long before she could ever imagine escape. And so when the day came, when her brother looked at her not as a sibling, but as a wife, there was no gasp, no outcry, only the silence of a family that had decided long before her birth what role she was destined to play. Their union was not celebrated, it was hidden. There were no large gatherings, no grand photographs, no records filed with joy. Instead, there was secrecy. The neighbors would whisper but never speak too loudly. The children of that marriage would grow up bearing the proof of what had been done, their very features revealing the truth no one dared to print. And the family? They carried on, pretending that nothing had happened, even as the walls of their farmhouse seemed to close tighter with every generation. This was not just marriage. It was a contract with silence, a pact with decay, and a vow that bound not just two siblings, but every life that came after them. The children who came from that union were born carrying the story their parents tried to bury. You could see it in their faces before they could even speak. The small deformities, the eyes that never seemed to align, the jaws that did not quite form as they should. Some were born frail, their bodies struggling to hold together against the weight of too much repetition in the blood. Others lived, but with minds that wandered in ways no schoolteacher could correct, leaving them half here and half lost in a fog that no one dared name. In those days, doctors rarely came to such remote places, and when they did, they didn't ask questions. Birth records were vague, illnesses went unnamed, and death certificates were filled with phrases like failure to thrive or unknown causes. But neighbors saw. They saw the way the children walked, the way their speech never quite matched their age, the way their eyes reflected more than they revealed, and still, nothing was spoken. Silence was safer than truth, because truth carried shame, and shame could destroy what little remained of a family already crumbling from the inside. Photographs tell the story most clearly. If you look at them, you'll notice the repetition, the same high foreheads, the same crooked smiles, the same haunted stare passed down like an heirloom. Nobody wanted, but nobody could throw away. Each child bore the mark of the union, as though the family name itself had grown tired of disguises and decided to etch the truth into every new face it created. The brother and sister carried on, pretending they had done nothing more than fulfill their duty to family and land. But deep inside, they must have known. Every cry of a newborn carried a question that could never be answered. Every cough, every fever, every stumble in the dirt must have reminded them that this was not just fate, it was consequence. They had chained their children to a legacy of brokenness, and though neighbors kept their silence, the children's bodies spoke louder than any whisper could. In the end, the family did not need outsiders to judge them. Their punishment was born in the cradle, staring back at them with eyes too close together, voices too soft to be understood, and futures already taken away before they could begin. As the years dragged forward, the union between brother and sister grew less like a marriage, and more like a shadow hanging over the land itself. Their farmhouse, once a modest but hopeful structure, began to sag under the weight of neglect, its windows clouded with dust, its roof bowing as if it too carried the shame of what went on inside. Visitors were few, and when they came, they never stayed long. The silence was too heavy, the air too thick with something unspoken. By now the children had grown older, and the marks of their inheritance became impossible to hide. Some were kept close to the house, never allowed to wander far, as though their very existence might invite questions. Others tried to mingle with the world beyond the fence line, only to be met with stares, cruel remarks, or the quiet turning of backs. The town had long since decided that it was easier not to interfere, easier to pretend that this family was simply strange, cursed by misfortune rather than bound by choice. But the truth seeped out in ways no one could control. Teachers noticed when the children could not keep pace. Shopkeepers noticed when their eyes didn't meet, when their words stumbled and broke apart before leaving their mouths. And always there were whispers, never loud, never written, but passed from one mouth to another. That family, people would say, that house, stay away. The stigma itself became another wall around the siblings, another chain binding their children to a future already determined. Inside those walls, the relationship between brother and sister hardened into something more disturbing. Love was replaced by duty, and duty by resentment. Arguments turned to silence, silence turned to bitterness, and bitterness became a quiet war that stretched on for decades. Yet still, they remained together, bound not by choice, but by the prison of secrecy they had built a row on themselves. Leaving was impossible. Undoing what they had done was unthinkable. And so they endured, even as every face around their table reminded them of the vow that had sealed their fate. The brother aged first, his body worn from labor and guilt. The sister aged differently, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling, her voice cracking with the weight of years lived in quiet suffocation. They had bound themselves together in a way no one should, and the years did not let them forget. Time itself became their punishment, each passing day another reminder that some choices cannot be buried, no matter how deep you dig. There is a particular cruelty in how a secret refuses to stay buried. The brother and sister had sworn to silence, and yet the truth seeped into every corner of their lives, poisoning even the smallest moments. By the time their children had grown, the bloodline was already showing fractures that could no longer be hidden behind closed doors. Some of their sons and daughters wandered through life half-present, their thoughts scattered, their voices carrying an eerie, childlike quality, no matter how old they became. Others suffered in ways the body made plain: crooked spines, twisted jaws, skin so pale and fragile it seemed the world itself was too heavy for them. Yet even as the evidence grew undeniable, the family clung to its secrecy. To admit the truth would mean shattering the very foundation they had built their lives upon, so they told themselves lies. They said their children were sickly because the land was poor, the food scarce, the winters too harsh. They said misfortune had chosen them, that fate had simply been unkind. But fate had little to do with it. This was the slow unraveling of a choice made long ago, a choice that echoed through every generation that followed. And here is where the silence becomes most haunting, not in what was done, but in what was not done. Neighbors remained quiet. Relatives who knew kept their distance, but never spoke aloud. The church, the supposed keeper of moral order, turned its eyes away. To expose the family was to expose the community, to admit that such darkness could exist not in far-off lands or in whispered myths, but right here in plain sight. The children carried the weight of sins that were never their own, and as they grew, the cycle tightened its grip. Some married beyond the family, desperate for a chance at escape, but the shadow followed them. Others stayed, repeating the only pattern they had ever known. It was less a choice than a curse, one that chained every birth to the memory of that fateful day when a sister said "I do" to her brother. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent like the neighbors? Or would you have risked everything to end the cycle? History remembers kings and queens for marrying their cousins, emperors for wedding their nieces, rulers who twisted bloodlines to preserve crowns. But what makes this story so disturbing is that it did not happen in a palace or under the watch of history's gaze. It happened in obscurity, in a farmhouse no historian cared to visit, in a family no one thought worthy of recording. And yet, the consequences were just as grave. Children born with scars carved not by war, but by blood repeating itself until it broke. As the decades passed, the family's silence grew heavier than their sins. Old age did not free the brother and sister from what they had done. Instead, it left them haunted by the faces of their children, some who had lived broken lives, some who had died far too young. Every grave in the family plot became another reminder. Headstones etched with the same surname lined up row after row, each one a silent witness to choices no one dared speak of. The sister, once a young bride in white, grew into an old woman whose eyes never seemed to meet anyone else's for long. She carried her secret like a shroud, clinging to it even as death drew near. The brother grew bitter, hardened into silence, until words themselves became a rarity from his mouth. They had promised each other a future when they said their vows, but what they had truly promised was a cage, and that cage had not only trapped them, it had trapped their children, their grandchildren, and every whisper of their name. In time, the family line began to collapse under its own weight. Children grew up and left, some never to return. Others died without leaving children of their own. The bloodline that had turned inward for so long finally began to thin, like a candle burning itself out. And yet, even in its fading, the story remained. Neighbors passed it on in hushed tones, newspapers hinted without print-ins. Names, and the land itself seemed marked by their silence. Theirs was not just a union of brother and sister, it was a story of how secrecy can rot a family from within, how silence can preserve horror more effectively than words ever could. And though their names may be forgotten, their legacy lingers like a shadow that refuses to leave the earth it stained. When we peel back the final layer of this story, what remains is not scandal, it is tragedy. A tragedy born not just from the union of a brother and sister, but from the silence of everyone who knew and chose to look away. In that silence, a family folded in on itself until love became duty, duty became prison, and blood became both the bond and the curse. The most haunting part is not that it happened once, but that it endured. Generation after generation, the cycle repeated, each child carrying the weight of choices made long before their first breath. They inherited not just blood, but sorrow, and in their faces, in their fragile bodies, the truth was written so clearly that no record could erase it. Think of the sister who said, "I do." Did she know what she was agreeing to? Did she imagine the future her children would face? Or had the walls around her been so high, the silence so suffocating, that she believed there was no other path? In her voice that day, we do not hear joy, we hear resignation, and resignation is the most dangerous vow of all. Her brother stood across from her, bound not by passion, but by the twisted weight of inheritance. In marrying his sister, he was not defying society. He was surrendering to the narrow world that had raised him. Their union was not rebellion, it was surrender. And that surrender became the cage that held their children, their grandchildren, and every story whispered in the shadows long after they were gone. What is left now are fragments, old photographs with eyes that seem to stare too deeply, birth records that don't quite match, graves lined up under the same name, their silence more telling than any confession. The land remembers even if the people do not. And when the wind moves through those fields, it carries with it the echo of vows that should never have been spoken. This is the story of a marriage that was no a marriage at all, but a pact of silence that doomed a bloodline. A sister said, "I do," to her brother, and in doing so she bound her family to a fate darker than death, a fate that still lingers, waiting in the soil, waiting in the shadows, waiting to be remembered.